The first time Samantha laughed at me in front of those people, I did not feel anger. I felt the exact moment my marriage stopped breathing. It happened on a Friday night in a private dining room above a steakhouse in downtown Chicago, the kind of place with dark wood walls, white tablecloths, and glasses so polished they caught every candle flame like tiny warnings. I was sitting beside my wife, Bennett, 42 years old, wearing the same navy suit I wore to job interviews and funerals, trying to look like I belonged among her co-workers from Harrington and Cole. Samantha looked beautiful that night, sharp and effortless in a cream blazer, her hair pinned back, her smile bright enough to fool anyone who had never seen what it looked like after the guests went home. Across the table, her manager, Preston Hale, lifted his wine glass and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, "So, Lucas, what exactly do you do these days? Still consulting? Or is that just what men call being between things?" A few people chuckled. Not everyone, just enough. I smiled politely because that is what a husband does when he is trying not to embarrass his wife. Samantha could have touched my arm. She could have changed the subject. She could have given me one small look that said, "I know who you are even if they do not." Instead, she laughed. Not nervous. Not uncomfortable. She laughed like Preston had just said something clever, like I was the harmless little joke sitting next to her salad fork. The sound moved through me slowly, colder than the ice water sweating beside my plate. I looked down at my hands, folded neatly in my lap, and noticed I was not shaking. That surprised me. A man imagines betrayal as something loud, something that makes him stand up, throw words across a room, demand respect from people who already decided he did not deserve it. But real humiliation is quieter than that. It presses a thumb against your chest and waits to see whether you will make a scene. I did not. I sat there while Preston leaned back, pleased with himself, while Samantha dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin, still smiling, while the waiter came by with another bottle and asked if everything was all right. Everything was not all right. The room smelled like peppercorn steak and expensive perfume, but beneath it I could smell something ending. I had spent 14 years helping Samantha build the life she wanted, paying bills during her law school years, fixing the little house in Naperville room by room, taking the smaller opportunities because hers always seemed more urgent, more delicate, more deserving of protection. I never called it sacrifice. I called it marriage. That night, while she laughed at me under a chandelier, I finally understood the difference. Sacrifice is something you give. Disrespect is something someone takes and expects you to keep handing over. I reached for my water, took one slow sip, and looked at my wife as if seeing her from across a courtroom instead of across a dinner table. She did not notice. That was her first mistake. After the dinner, I walked out onto the balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline, the air crisp with the coming of winter and the distant hum of traffic below blending with the muffled conversations from inside. I leaned against the wrought iron railing, hands gripping it as if it could steady the swirl of thoughts in my head. Samantha had not followed me. She remained inside, smiling and laughing with colleagues, her voice a melody I had once adored but now struck like a bell in a chapel I no longer belonged to. I closed my eyes and let the night settle over me, listening to the faint sounds of the city, the occasional siren, the soft thrum of distant subway trains. Each sound reminded me of how alone I felt, not in the physical sense, but in the way that presence without understanding can make a person feel invisible. My life, our life, had been built on a series of small agreements, compromises, and shared moments that had seemed enough at the time, but that night revealed the fragility of those foundations. I remembered the early days of our marriage, moving into a small apartment in Naperville, both of us scrambling to make ends meet, laughing over takeout on the floor, plotting futures that now seemed like echoes of someone else's dream. I had always believed in the quiet strength of what we had, the resilience of shared responsibility and mutual respect. I had believed in Samantha, and now I realized that belief had been misplaced. The laughter I had heard was not only directed at me, it was a mirror reflecting a version of myself that no longer mattered to the person I loved. I took a deep breath, noticing how cold the winter air felt against my face, how the steel of the railing pressed into my palms, grounding me. I made a choice then, not from a place of anger, not from revenge, but from clarity. I would not let this night define me or dictate my worth. I would watch, I would observe, and I would act in a way that restored the balance that had been so carelessly tipped. I began to think about the small details I had ignored before, the slight inconsistencies in Samantha's stories, the late nights at the office she had never fully explained, the little signals I had brushed aside in favor of trust. Each one now formed a pattern that I could not ignore. I walked back inside, moving quietly through the hallway, past the tables where her friends and colleagues still laughed, still oblivious to the shift in the air that they could not see. I sat at the end of the table, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, but inside a careful calculation was taking shape. I would need evidence, confirmation, a record that could not be disputed, and I would have to act with precision. I could not allow emotion to cloud judgment. The most potent power lies in silence paired with knowledge. As I watched Samantha smile across the room, unaware of the storm gathering behind my eyes, I felt the first stirrings of a plan that would change the course of our lives, a plan built on patience, observation, and the quiet reclaiming of my own agency. Over the next few days, I began noticing small inconsistencies in Samantha's routine that I had previously dismissed as harmless. She would leave her phone charging in unusual places, often stepping away to answer calls with a smile that seemed just a little too practiced. Invitations to lunch with colleagues that once seemed mundane now carried a subtle weight, a suggestion of secrets hidden just beyond my perception. I observed quietly, learning to read the pauses in her sentences, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the doorway whenever she thought I was not watching. I spent hours reviewing calendars, messages, and appointments that had seemed innocent on their surface, piecing together a pattern that told me there was more beneath the polished exterior of our shared life. Each small discovery was cataloged mentally, forming a map of truths and half-truths that had quietly accumulated over years. One evening, while Samantha was engaged in a conference call, I lingered near her desk, pretending to organize papers, but actually taking note of the way she interacted with the digital files, the way certain folders were opened and closed with meticulous attention. I noticed a particular folder that seemed to appear and disappear, never there when I looked directly, but always in her recent access log. That discovery sparked the first real shift in my thinking. I realized that I was not powerless, that information could be as commanding as presence, that observation could be my leverage. I began recording the subtle interactions that revealed inconsistencies, small moments that Samantha considered insignificant, yet collectively they formed a narrative that had gone unnoticed. I could see now that her confidence was built on my unawareness, on the assumption that I was content with the surface of our life. I decided to reclaim that ground, to act with deliberate precision rather than impulsive reaction. Over the course of a week, I tested boundaries quietly, leaving small markers that could later validate my observations, confirming patterns without confrontation. Each day, as Samantha continued her routines, unaware that her actions were being documented, I felt a growing sense of control, a measured calm replacing the initial sting of humiliation. My planning was methodical, not driven by anger, but by clarity of purpose. I reminded myself repeatedly that the goal was not punishment for its own sake, but the restoration of balance, the subtle demonstration that knowledge and preparation could shift outcomes more powerfully than confrontation. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive understanding of the discrepancies, the timeline, and the hidden intentions that had so quietly undermined the foundation of our shared life. Sitting in the quiet of the home office, watching the city lights shimmer through the blinds, I felt a sense of readiness. The pieces were in place, the strategy clear, and the next step would be executed with the same deliberate patience that had guided every observation until this point. It was not the moment to act yet, but it was the moment to be fully prepared, the moment to know that the balance had shifted and that the power to turn events toward resolution was finally within reach. By Sunday morning, the house in Naperville had returned to its usual quiet, but it no longer felt like home in the simple way it used to. The winter light came through the kitchen windows in pale strips, stretching across the hardwood floor, touching the breakfast table where Samantha sat with her laptop open and a cup of coffee cooling beside her. She wore one of my old Northwestern sweatshirts, the one I used to joke looked better on her than it ever did on me. Years ago, that sight would have softened me. That morning, it only reminded me how easily familiar things could disguise distance. She typed with one hand and scrolled with the other, her wedding ring catching the light every few seconds. bright and meaningless. I stood at the counter, buttering toast, watching the tiny habits I once loved. The way she tilted her head before sending an email. The way she touched her lower lip when choosing words. The way her smile appeared before the message was finished, as if someone on the other side of the screen had reached into the room and taken a seat between us. I asked if she wanted eggs. She said no without looking up. That was not cruelty. That was worse. It was indifference polished smooth by repetition. Marriage does not always collapse in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it thins out, one ignored question at a time, until two people can stand 10 feet apart and live in separate climates. I carried my coffee into the small den off the hallway, the room where I kept old tax folders, project binders, and photographs Samantha never bothered to frame. On the top shelf was a dusty blue box from our first apartment, still labeled in her handwriting, future stuff. I took it down and sat on the carpet like a younger version of myself had called me there. Inside were pieces of another life. A receipt from a pizza place in Evanston dated 2 weeks after our wedding. A postcard from Wisconsin Dells where we once spent 3 rainy days laughing because the hotel pool was colder than Lake Michigan. A photo of Samantha standing beside me in front of our first rented duplex, both of us squinting in the sun, both of us broke, exhausted, and proud. Back then, she held my arm like it mattered. Back then, I was not a prop in her success story. I was the man she whispered plans to at midnight. I paid her bar exam fees with money I had saved for a truck. I took extra contract work designing systems for small manufacturing plants because she needed time to study, and I never once made her feel small for needing help. That was the part that settled heavy in my chest. I had not failed her. I had invested in us. Somewhere along the way, she changed the name on the account and called it hers. I picked up the old photograph and studied my own face. I looked younger, yes, but not weaker. That man believed patience was love. He believed loyalty would be recognized eventually. He believed a woman who shared his last name would never let strangers laugh at his dignity and join in. I slid the photo back into the box and closed the lid gently, not because the memories were worthless, but because they could no longer be allowed to testify against the truth. From the kitchen, Samantha laughed softly at something on her screen. This time, the sound did not break me. It clarified me. I opened my laptop, pulled up a folder I had not touched in months, and reviewed the documents tied to Bennett Systems Consulting, the private firm I had built quietly after leaving corporate engineering. Samantha knew I did freelance work. She did not know the full scale. She did not know about the municipal contracts in Illinois and Indiana, the logistics software license, or the silent partnership agreement signed 3 years earlier with a firm whose largest client was, unfortunately for her, Harrington and Cole. I had kept my success quiet because I thought humility protected a marriage. Now I understood that silence had only given her room to underestimate me. That afternoon, I walked through the quiet streets of Naperville, the snow beginning to coat the sidewalks in a thin, glistening layer, reflecting the pale winter sun. My hands were tucked into the pockets of my wool coat, my breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Every step gave me space to think, to organize the plan I had been refining for the past week. I considered the office where Bennett Systems Consulting operated, the contracts I had quietly secured, and the digital records that proved I had been building more than just a living. I had been building leverage, unnoticed but powerful. The thought of Samantha, still inside our home, laughing at emails and conference calls, contrasted sharply with the image I had formed of myself during these walks, patient, deliberate, observing every detail, ready to act when the timing was right. I remembered moments in our shared life when she had underestimated me, moments I had brushed aside to keep the peace, thinking compromise and trust were the pillars of our marriage. Now, I saw those same moments as clues, pieces of a puzzle that had never been fully visible until I stepped back and allowed perspective to guide me. I arrived at a small coffee shop that I had frequented during my consulting years, choosing a corner table where I could watch the street and remain unnoticed. My laptop opened to the spreadsheet of transactions and emails I had compiled over several years, every entry confirming patterns, timelines, and decisions that Samantha had not considered significant, but which collectively painted a clear picture of intent and oversight. I sipped a warm Americano, letting the heat settle my thoughts, and traced the data with my finger, imagining how the upcoming conversation would unfold once I chose to act. There was no rush. Patience was my ally. Observation had taught me that the most effective leverage was built not in the heat of confrontation, but in the quiet accumulation of evidence and understanding. I noted the specific times when Samantha had coordinated meetings or sent messages that conflicted with what she had told me, each entry logged in a separate column with annotations about who was involved and potential impact. The structure of this record gave me clarity and focus. Outside, children played in the shallow snow along the sidewalks, their laughter distant and bright, a reminder of normalcy, of life continuing outside of this personal tension. I thought of the moments in our marriage when I had celebrated small victories quietly, from completing early project deadlines to supporting Samantha through her bar exam. Those acts of commitment had been the foundation of my identity in our relationship, yet they had gone unnoticed, unacknowledged, dismissed in the sound of laughter that now echoed in my memory. I closed the laptop for a moment, looking out the window at the streetlights beginning to glow as the afternoon waned, and felt a calm resolve. The groundwork was complete, the information intact, and the next steps would unfold with precision and control. I returned home, snow crunching under my boots, prepared to move forward not from anger but from a measured strategy, ready to restore the balance that had long been tipped and to reclaim my place not through confrontation, but through the quiet assertion of knowledge, timing, and the undeniable presence of preparation. The following Monday morning arrived with a flat gray sky and a wind that pushed dry snow across the driveway in thin, restless lines. Samantha left before 7, dressed in a charcoal coat and black heels, her leather work bag hanging from one shoulder, her phone already pressed to her ear before she reached the front walk. She gave me a distracted wave through the windshield of her Lexus, the kind you give a neighbor you almost recognize, and backed out toward downtown Chicago without waiting for me to wave back. I stood in the doorway with my coffee cooling in my hand, watching her taillights disappear beyond the bare maple trees, and felt the silence of the house settle behind me like a door locking from the inside. That was the morning I stopped reacting and started moving. By 8:30, I was in my office above a small accounting firm in Oak Brook, the kind of leased space Samantha once called temporary even after I had kept it profitable for 6 straight years. The building was plain brick, 2 stories, nothing impressive from the street. That was the point. Men like Preston Hale looked for power in glass towers, polished shoes, reserved parking signs, and nameplates outside conference rooms. They never looked for it in quiet offices with old carpet, good coffee, and file cabinets organized by people who knew exactly what they were doing. My assistant, Grace Monroe, looked up from her desk when I walked in and gave me the expression she saved for serious mornings. Grace was 61, sharp as a tax notice, and had been with me since Bennett Systems Consulting was just me, one laptop, and a rented printer that jammed every Thursday. She knew numbers. She knew people. Most importantly, she knew when not to ask unnecessary questions. I handed her a folder and said, "Please pull the Harrington and Cole vendor agreement, the renewal schedule, and every service amendment tied to Preston Hale's division." Her eyebrow rose half an inch. That was Grace shouting. "All of it?" she asked. "All of it," I said. She nodded once and turned to her computer. No drama, just work. I stepped into my office, closed the door, and looked at the framed map on the wall showing every county where our logistics software supported municipal maintenance routing. DuPage, Cook, Lake, Will, Marion County down in Indiana. Small dots, steady growth. Samantha had never asked about the map. She thought I kept it there for motivation, the way some men kept golf trophies or college diplomas. She did not know those dots represented contracts, renewals, support fees, and influence that moved quietly through places where decisions mattered. At 9:15, Grace knocked and came in with 3 binders stacked against her chest. "You are going to want to see Section 12, she said. Section 12 was the termination and compliance review clause. Standard language, boring to anyone who did not understand business, beautiful to anyone who did. Harrington and Cole had agreed to performance transparency, ethical procurement standards, and conflict disclosure on all departments using our systems integration tools. Preston's division had pushed through a renewal last spring. Samantha had helped prepare internal review documents for that same division. I read the clause twice, then a third time, not because I did not understand it, but because understanding it too quickly can make a man careless. The paper did not shout. It whispered. And sometimes a whisper carries farther than a threat. By noon, I had scheduled a compliance review for the following week, requested communication records through the proper business channels, and instructed Grace to notify our outside counsel that I wanted every step clean, documented, and boring enough to survive scrutiny. That word mattered. Clean. I was not going to embarrass myself chasing emotion through dark corners. I was not going to become the angry husband they expected me to be. I was going to become the one thing they had not prepared for, precise. As I signed the request letters, my phone lit up with a message from Samantha. Dinner with the team tonight. Do not wait up. I looked at the screen, then at the binders on my desk, and for the first time since that night above the steakhouse, I smiled without bitterness. She thought I was still standing on that balcony, wounded and confused, replaying her laughter like a man trapped in a bad memory. She had no idea I had already stepped off that balcony, walked into the machinery behind her perfect life, and found the switchboard. By Tuesday afternoon, the compliance review had become real enough to leave fingerprints. Grace had sent the notices, outside counsel had confirmed receipt, and Harrington and Cole had been asked to produce procurement records, internal approval notes, and conflict disclosures tied to Preston Hale's division by the end of the week. The request was professional, neutral, and dry as printer paper. That made it dangerous. Emotional accusations can be dismissed. Clean documentation has weight. I spent most of the day in my Oak Brook office, reading through service amendments while the heater clicked in the wall and sleet tapped softly against the window. Every page told a quiet story. A rushed approval here. A missing disclosure there. A preferred vendor recommendation that should have been reviewed by someone outside Preston's circle. Nothing explosive by itself. That is how people get comfortable. They count on each small irregularity being too boring to matter. But business, like marriage, rarely breaks from one large crack. It fails through repeated pressure in the same weak place. Around 4 o'clock, Grace stepped into my doorway with her reading glasses low on her nose and a printed email in her hand. "You should see this," she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes had gone still. The email came from Harrington and Cole's operations department, accidentally copying our general compliance inbox instead of their internal review team. It referenced a dinner scheduled for Thursday night at the Langham Hotel, private room, Preston Hale hosting, Samantha listed as attending, and me, interestingly, not invited. The subject line read, Vendor Strategy Alignment. I almost laughed at that. People hide knives inside soft language because it makes the table look cleaner. Attached was a draft agenda with one item highlighted in yellow, transition away from Bennett systems during next renewal cycle. There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not innocent office gossip. A plan. My wife had sat beside me while her manager mocked me, then walked back into the machinery of her company and helped prepare a strategy to remove my firm from a contract she had never even admitted mattered. I set the paper on my desk and looked out at the parking lot, where slush gathered around the tires of cars belonging to ordinary people with ordinary problems. For a moment, the old part of me wanted an explanation. It wanted to call her, ask why, push for the sentence that would make the wound logical. But grown men eventually learn that explanations from people who benefit from your confusion are usually just new rooms in the same maze. I picked up my phone and called Daniel Reeves, our outside counsel. Daniel had the voice of a man who never spent a word he did not intend to bill for. I read him the email, the agenda item, and Samantha's name on the attendee list. He was quiet for 3 seconds. "Do not contact her about it," he said. "Do not contact Preston. Preserve the message, forward it to me, and let the review process continue." That was why I paid Daniel. He kept the matches away from the gasoline. When I hung up, Grace was still standing there. "Personal or business?" she asked. I looked at the email again, at the neat corporate language wrapped around betrayal. "Both," I said. She nodded like she already knew. By 6:30, I was home. Samantha's Lexus was gone, the driveway shining under a thin coat of ice. Inside, the house smelled faintly of her perfume and the lavender candle she lit whenever she wanted the rooms to feel warmer than they were. On the kitchen island, she had left a note. "Team dinner. Late night. Do not wait up." Her handwriting was smooth, confident, familiar. I stood there reading it under the pendant lights, feeling the strange calm that comes when doubt finally stops arguing with truth. I did not wait up. I made coffee, walked into the den, opened the blue box from our first apartment, and removed the photograph of us in front of the rented duplex. This time, I did not put it back. I placed it face down in the bottom drawer of my desk, under the compliance binders, under the contracts, under the paper trail she never knew existed. Memory had its place. Evidence had the higher shelf. Thursday arrived wearing the kind of cold that made every window in Oak Brook look faintly blue. I spent the morning in the office with the door closed, the compliance binders spread across my desk, each tab marking a decision someone at Harrington and Cole thought would never be questioned by the man they had mistaken for background noise. Grace brought in coffee at 10 and said nothing when she saw the Langham agenda printed beside the vendor agreement. Silence was one of her better talents. By noon, Daniel Reeves had sent me a clean summary of our legal position, careful language, no accusations, no emotional color, just contract terms, disclosure obligations, and the consequences of interference with an active vendor relationship. He had highlighted one sentence near the bottom. Any attempt to terminate services without documented cause may trigger damages, audit rights, and disclosure review. I read that line until it settled into me. Not because it felt like revenge, because it felt like a door opening from the correct side. At 4:30, I changed into a dark suit in the office restroom, knotted a gray tie, and looked at myself under fluorescent lights that made every man look more tired than he felt. I did not look powerful. I looked ordinary. That was fine. Ordinary men sign payroll. Ordinary men build companies in rented offices. Ordinary men keep receipts. The city traffic crawled as I drove toward downtown Chicago, snow turning to wet streaks across the windshield, the skyline rising ahead like a row of steel witnesses. I parked 2 blocks from the Langham and walked the rest of the way, letting the cold air sharpen me. Inside, the lobby smelled like polished stone, cedar, and money that did not have to introduce itself. A young hostess checked the private room list, smiled politely, and asked for my name. Lucas Bennett, I said. Her smile flickered. There are moments when a room knows something before the people inside it do. I saw that flicker and understood Daniel had done his part. She led me down a quiet corridor to a private dining room, where Preston Hale sat at the head of a long table, Samantha to his right. 3 executives from Harrington and Cole scattered around them with water glasses, leather folders, and the relaxed confidence of people who believed the meeting belonged to them. Preston looked up first. His face performed recognition, then amusement, then something smaller. Samantha turned next. For 1 second, she looked like my wife. Not the polished attorney, not the woman from the steakhouse, just Samantha, startled, exposed, and searching for a script. I gave her none. Lucas, she said too brightly. What are you doing here? I looked at the empty chair near the far end of the table, then at the printed agenda in front of Preston. I was invited by the contract, I said. No one laughed. That was the first change. Preston leaned back, trying to recover the room with posture alone. This is an internal strategy discussion, he said. I nodded. About replacing my company as a systems vendor during an active renewal period involving disclosure requirements my firm is entitled to review. The words were not loud, but they landed with corners. One executive lowered his pen. Another glanced at Samantha. Preston's jaw tightened just enough to tell me he had not expected language. He had expected emotion. I placed Daniel's summary on the table and slid it forward with 2 fingers. Our counsel received the compliance materials. Since my wife is listed on documents tied to both the internal review and the proposed transition, I thought it was better to clarify everything in person, professionally, before anyone made a mistake that became expensive. Samantha's hand moved toward her water glass and stopped halfway. Her wedding ring flashed under the private room lights, the same bright circle I had watched in our kitchen days earlier. Preston opened the folder, scanned the first page, and the color slowly left the confidence in his face. That was the second change. The third came when the oldest executive at the table, a woman named Margaret Ellison, looked directly at Samantha and asked, "You did not disclose that Bennett Systems was your husband's company?" The room went still. Not dramatic still. Corporate still. The kind of still where careers begin quietly calculating distance from a problem. Samantha's lips parted, but no answer came. For once, she had no polished sentence ready. I pulled out the chair, sat down, and folded my hands on the table. I am not here to argue, I said. I am here to make sure the record is accurate. Preston stared at the documents as if the paper had betrayed him. Samantha stared at me as if I had walked out of a version of myself she had buried without checking for a pulse. After clarifying the record in the Langham private room, I remained seated, letting the quiet gravity of the moment settle across the table. Samantha shifted in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the leather folder in front of her, the kind of repetitive motion people use when thinking and stalling at the same time. Preston Hale read the first page of the summary again, eyes narrowing, lips pressed, realizing the consequences embedded in language so calm it could not be argued with. I took a slow breath and reviewed each point aloud, noting compliance obligations, timelines for disclosure, and the limits of authority any division head could exercise without explicit consent. The executives leaned forward, pens poised, yet every movement betrayed a subtle recognition. Their assumptions had been incomplete. Samantha finally looked up at me, the practiced professional mask slipping for the briefest moment, replaced by uncertainty. I did not speak to her directly, yet every word landed where it mattered. "It is essential," I said, "that all transitions adhere to the contract and the documented disclosures. Any deviation risks audit findings, damages, and regulatory review. We all have a duty to ensure proper oversight." The room remained still, the air taut, as though each individual was recalculating what was possible, what had been overlooked. Preston ran a hand along the edge of the folder and cleared his throat. "I was not aware that these clauses were interpreted in this way," he said. I nodded. "It is not interpretation. It is documentation. Records exist to prevent misunderstanding. Review them carefully." Samantha's hands rested on the table now, motionless, her gaze shifting between Preston and the summary in front of me. I did not look at her. I focused on the agenda, the points highlighted in yellow, and the binding clauses that ensured accountability. Grace had instructed me well. Daniel's review covered every angle, leaving no opportunity for dispute. I noted silently the subtle looks exchanged among the other executives, the small gestures of acknowledgement that the terms I read were not trivial. One of them, a mid-level manager, finally spoke, voice low but steady. "We will need to follow the documented process, yes." That was enough. The room had collectively understood, without public confrontation, that the authority I represented was real, deliberate, and backed by compliance. Samantha exhaled slowly, a quiet sound that seemed to acknowledge the shift she had not seen coming. I folded my hands on the table and let the meeting continue without interruption, noting every question, every hesitation, every correction that now had to pass through proper channels. By the time the group disbanded, the agenda items had been settled in my favor, the internal review initiated, and the balance quietly restored. No anger had been raised, no spectacle created, just clarity, precision, and the undeniable weight of preparation meeting opportunity. As I stepped out of the private room, the winter light outside the hotel windows struck a muted glow across the street, the city continuing in its indifferent rhythm, while inside, the balance between what had been assumed and what was documented had irrevocably shifted. Samantha followed a few steps behind, shoulders slightly less confident, and I realized, with measured calm, that control had quietly returned to the place it had always belonged. Not through spectacle, not through noise, but through preparation, knowledge, and the patience to let the truth speak louder than any laughter could. The hallway outside the private dining room felt colder than it should have, marble underfoot, soft hotel music overhead, city lights pressing against the tall windows like quiet witnesses. I had made it halfway toward the elevators when Samantha said my name. Not the public version, not the smooth, practiced Lucas she used in front of clients and colleagues, but the smaller one, the one that used to find me across grocery aisles and crowded airports. I stopped, but I did not turn right away. That pause mattered. For years, I had turned the moment she called. I had been trained by love to respond quickly, to soften first, to make room for her explanation before I had even understood my own pain. That night, I let the silence answer before I did. When I finally faced her, Samantha stood beneath a wall sconce, her cream coat folded over one arm, her expression caught between embarrassment and calculation. Behind her, Preston Hale remained in the private room, his voice low and tense as Margaret Ellison asked questions he should have been ready to answer. "You should have told me," Samantha said. I looked at her, almost curious. Told you what? She glanced toward the closed door, then back at me. About your company. About Harrington and Cole. About all of this. There it was. Not an apology for laughing. Not regret for hiding my connection to the contract. Not concern over the way she had sat beside a man who treated me like furniture and smiled while he did it. She was upset because the information had not belonged to her first. The realization did not cut the way I expected. It settled. Heavy, final, useful. You knew I had a consulting firm, I said. You never asked what it did. Her mouth tightened. That is not fair. I almost smiled at the word. Fair. The word people reach for when the advantage leaves their side of the table. Fair was 14 years of me clapping for every room you walked into, I said quietly. Fair was paying bills while you studied, moving meetings when your career needed air, sitting through dinners where I became the joke so you could stay comfortable. Her eyes flashed, then softened, then searched my face for the old door. The one she used to open whenever she wanted me to forgive before we finished talking. I kept it closed. Lucas, Preston was being rude. I should not have laughed. But this, what you did in there, you made me look like I had hidden something. You did hide something, I said. My relationship to the vendor review was a conflict you should have disclosed. My relationship to you was a marriage you should have respected. The words hung there, neither loud nor cruel, but exact. A couple walked past us toward the elevators, talking softly about theater tickets, unaware that a marriage was ending 6 feet away from a vase of white orchids. Samantha lowered her voice. Can we talk about this at home? Home. Another word that had lost its furniture. I looked through the hotel glass at the wet street below, taxis sliding through traffic, people hurrying under black umbrellas, everyone trying to reach somewhere warm. No, I said. Not tonight. She blinked, and for the first time in years, I saw fear without performance. What does that mean? I took my phone from my coat pocket and opened the message from Daniel that had arrived during the meeting. Temporary separation agreement draft ready when needed. Clean, documented, calm. I did not show it to her. I did not need to. It means I am going to my office, I said. Tomorrow, my attorney will contact yours. Business stays business. Marriage becomes legal. Her hand moved slightly, as if she wanted to touch my sleeve, but she stopped before she reached me. Maybe she finally understood that access is not the same thing as intimacy. You cannot just decide that in a hallway, she whispered. I looked at her then, really looked, at the woman I had loved through school debt, winter leaks, bad apartments, career storms, and years of being quietly edited out of her pride. No, I said. I decided it at that table when you laughed. The hallway is just where you are hearing it. The elevator doors opened behind me with a soft chime. I stepped inside, turned around, and watched Samantha stand there beneath the warm hotel lights, smaller than she had looked upstairs, smaller than she had looked in every room where I once made myself smaller for her. As the doors closed, her reflection split across the polished metal until there were 2 of her, then none. Downstairs, the lobby smelled like cedar and rain. I walked out into the Chicago night without rushing, the cold air filling my lungs, my phone silent in my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like a husband trying to be chosen. I felt like a man who had finally chosen himself. The next morning, the Oak Brook office felt unusually quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound above the occasional shuffle of papers. I arrived early, walking past the lobby with its polished marble and minimal decoration, coffee in hand, each sip warming the chill of a Chicago winter that had settled over the streets like a heavy gray blanket. Grace was already at her desk, organizing the compliance files and emails, her expression neutral but alert, a sentinel for details I had learned to trust more than most people. I laid the Langham agenda beside the binders from Harrington and Cole and opened my laptop to check that all requested documents had been received and properly logged. Each file confirmed a series of dates, communications, and approvals that mapped exactly to the timeline I had reconstructed over the past week. Nothing had been overlooked, nothing misfiled. The preparation felt almost ritualistic, the methodical work providing a sense of control I had not known I needed. Around 9:15, the first email from Daniel arrived, confirming that all submissions were in the hands of the legal team, properly timestamped and verified for accuracy. I read it carefully, noting how calm the language was, how deliberately precise, each sentence structured to prevent any ambiguity or argument. I closed the message and leaned back in my chair, letting the chair creak under the shift of weight, and stared out at the leafless trees through the office window. The street beyond glistened with slush and reflections from passing vehicles, ordinary people heading to ordinary jobs, unaware of the shifting power quietly unfolding in the small office above the accounting firm. At 10 o'clock, Samantha called. Her voice, normally confident, carried a trace of uncertainty that she could not mask. "Lucas, are you at the office?" she asked. I did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to emphasize the pause. "I am," I said finally, measured and calm. "Do you need something?" She hesitated, then spoke carefully, choosing words that might soften or stall. "I wanted to discuss the agenda from last night. There were points I did not understand." I leaned back, keeping my tone neutral. "The agenda is under review. Any clarification should go through the proper channels. This ensures accuracy and maintains compliance." She exhaled audibly on the other end, a soft sound that suggested recognition of the shift in authority. "You are proceeding with the review," she said, and I simply replied, "Correct." The line went quiet, and I felt the subtle satisfaction of a step taken, not with confrontation or spectacle, but with measured application of knowledge and preparation. By midday, the binders were sorted, the compliance requests organized for submission, and every detail checked twice. I looked at Samantha's name on the emails and agendas, seeing clearly how her previous assumptions about my role had left her exposed to the consequences she had not considered. I did not feel triumph. I felt the quiet clarity of a balance restored. At 1 o'clock, I stood at the office window, watching the city move in its usual rhythm, taxis sliding past, pedestrians navigating wet sidewalks, the winter sun diffused through clouds. I knew she would arrive in the late afternoon for the final review, and by then, everything would be positioned exactly as it needed to be. No words had been shouted, no spectacle made, only a precise assertion of responsibility, authority, and preparation. The shift had occurred, and it was irreversible. I returned to my desk, organized the binders once more, and watched as the day progressed, aware that every moment was reinforcing the position I had quietly, deliberately established, ensuring that the foundation I had built over years could not be questioned or undermined. By 4:15 that afternoon, the final review meeting had been moved from Harrington and Cole's downtown office to a conference room at our Oakbrook building, a small but meaningful change that nobody said out loud. Location has gravity. For years, Samantha had lived inside rooms where her name carried weight, where people stood when she entered and softened their voices when she spoke. That day, she walked into mine. Grace led them in without ceremony. Samantha first, then Margaret Ellison, 2 compliance officers, a senior procurement director, and Preston Hale last, his coat folded over his arm, his expression doing its best impression of confidence. The conference room was simple, glass walls, a long walnut table, a screen mounted at one end, bottled water arranged with the kind of plain efficiency Grace considered hospitality. I stood when they entered, shook hands with everyone, including Preston, because dignity is not weakness. It is control with manners. Samantha avoided my eyes at first. She wore a navy dress and low heels, her hair pinned back the same way it had been the night she laughed at the steakhouse, but the shine was gone from her face. She looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from finally having to carry the weight of consequences in public. Daniel Reeves joined by video, his face filling the screen with calm professional indifference. Once everyone sat down, Margaret opened the meeting. "We are here to resolve the disclosure issue, the vendor transition issue, and any related conflict concerns," she said. Her voice was not angry. That made it worse for Preston. Anger gives people something to push against. Procedure gives them nowhere to stand. The first 20 minutes were all documents. Dates, emails, approval paths, renewal language. Samantha's name appeared 3 times where it should have been disclosed and was not. Preston's appeared 6 times beside recommendations that benefited an outside competitor before the review period had formally opened. Nobody accused anyone of anything dramatic. They did not have to. The screen did the work. Each document appeared. Each timestamp clicked into place. Each silence after each slide grew heavier than the last. Preston tried once to call it an informal discussion. Daniel corrected him before the sentence cooled. "The document refers to the meeting as vendor strategy alignment," he said. The wording is internal, but the intent is clear enough to require review. Preston looked down. Samantha finally spoke when her second email appeared, the one where she had suggested that the transition could be made smoother if Bennett's systems was not notified until preliminary support had been secured. Her voice came out careful, almost thin. I did not understand Lucas's company was directly involved at that level. I looked at her then. Not sharply, not cruelly, just long enough for the room to understand what she had said and what it meant. Margaret leaned back, folding her hands. You are married to the owner, she said. Samantha swallowed. Yes. And you did not ask. That question landed harder than any speech I could have given. Samantha had no answer that made her look better. Across the table, Preston's face had gone pale beneath the hotel tan he wore like armor. His division had not only failed to disclose a conflict, it had attempted to steer a contract away from a vendor with audit rights while using a staff attorney with a direct personal connection to that vendor. By the time Daniel finished summarizing the exposure, the procurement director had already closed his folder. That sound, soft cardboard against paper, told me the outcome before anyone announced it. Harrington and Cole would suspend Preston's authority over the renewal, open an internal review, preserve the Bennett Systems agreement, and issue a corrective disclosure. Samantha would be removed from all matters involving my company pending ethics review. The room accepted it quietly, because that is how institutions protect themselves. They do not scream. They distance. Preston stared at the table. Samantha stared at her hands. I felt no joy watching it happen. Joy belongs to games. This was not a game. This was the bill arriving after a long dinner where other people had ordered on my name. When the meeting ended, Margaret shook my hand and said, Mr. Bennett, we appreciate your professionalism. Samantha flinched at that word. Professionalism. The thing she had assumed I lacked because I did not perform importance loudly. As they filed out, Preston did not look at me. Samantha paused by the door, her face full of things she wanted to say and none she had earned the right to say in that room. I gathered my papers, slid them into the binder, and let Grace turn off the screen. The glass walls reflected the empty table back at me, clean, orderly, undeniable. The laughter from the steakhouse felt far away now, like noise from another floor. It had not disappeared. It had simply been answered in a language everyone in that room understood. That evening, I returned to the Oak Brook house alone. The sky over Chicago deepening into muted shades of navy and charcoal, the streetlights casting long, thin reflections across wet asphalt. The Lexus was gone from the driveway, leaving only the quiet impression of absence where Samantha had once claimed space. I carried a small stack of the compliance binders and the agendas from Harrington and Cole into the den, placing them neatly on the walnut desk where the blue box from our first apartment still rested. I opened the box, looking once more at the photograph of us in the duplex, the sun catching our younger faces in a way that seemed to freeze the moment between laughter and responsibility. I did not smile. I simply set it aside, knowing that memory was a private possession, separate from the reality I had just created. The house was still, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional draft around the windows marking the passage of time. I walked through each room slowly, observing the space we had once shared, recognizing the traces of shared life, but acknowledging that the weight of decisions could no longer be carried equally. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and stood by the island, watching the reflection of the city lights on the polished countertop. Each reflection was a reminder that clarity comes from perspective, not proximity. I sat at the desk, opening my laptop to review the emails from the internal review process, noting that every submission, every timestamp, and every document had been logged precisely as planned. Grace had followed my instructions without deviation. Daniel had confirmed all legal language, and the outcome from the conference room had set the record in stone without drama, without spectacle, leaving only facts and the quiet enforcement of procedure. I felt a sense of calm, the kind that arises when the work is complete, the preparation thorough, and the path forward clear. There was no elation, no vindictiveness, only the certainty that the situation had been addressed with precision and professionalism. I closed the laptop, stacked the binders, and leaned back in my chair, listening to the distant hum of the winter city and the quiet of the house around me. Outside, traffic flowed, people moving on with their lives, unaware of the subtle shift that had occurred inside these walls, inside these rooms of glass, wood, and quiet authority. The blue box remained on the shelf, a reminder of years past, yet no longer a measure of influence or control. The photograph faced downward, preserved, separated from action. I poured another glass of water and stood by the window, watching the city breathe through the night. For the first time in many months, I felt unshaken, not by arrogance or triumph, but by the steady knowledge that preparation, patience, and clarity had restored the balance that laughter and assumptions had once threatened to undo. Samantha would return, the city would continue, and I would remain grounded in the work I had done, the evidence carefully preserved, and the quiet but undeniable assertion of agency I had claimed. The night deepened, the streetlights glimmered on wet pavement, and I understood, finally, that control, responsibility, and calm would guide what came next, not noise, not resentment, and not the fleeting impressions of a moment that had already passed.